The winter of 1874 didn't just freeze Iowa. It killed people in their own homes. Families burned through all their wood and still woke up to frozen walls. But one woman survived that winter differently. She didn't have more firewood. She didn't have better tools. What she had was a pile of dried corn cobs and an idea no one believed would work. And it started with a simple argument between a mother and her daughter. "You are packing the cobs too loose," Annika said. She was standing on the split-rail scaffold her mother had built against the north wall of the new addition, holding a dried corn cob in each hand and watching Lotte work the row below her. Lotte Brandt did not stop pushing cobs into the cavity between the inner and outer wall boards. She worked each cob in at a slight angle, fat end first, this turning at a quarter rotation until it locked against its neighbors and held without being forced. The row was 12 cobs wide, and the wall was 8 feet tall, and she had been doing this since first light. "They are packed correctly," Lotte said. "Tight enough to hold, not so tight they crack and compress. Your grandfather packed rye sheaves the same way in Poznań. You always say that, because it is always true." Annika set both cobs on the scaffold plank and dropped down to the ground beside her mother, studying the work. The wall cavity was 14 inches wide, deliberately wider than standard timber frame construction, which ran 8 to 10 inches. Lotte had cut every stud herself, spacing them to produce the wider cavity, working from a measurement she had scratched onto a shingle with a nail before she began framing. If 14 inches was the width that allowed a dried field corn cob to sit crosswise at a slight angle without rattling. She had tested this in September with a single section of wall before she built the rest, packing and unpacking until the geometry was right. The addition was 12 feet by 16, attached to the east face of the original Brandt cabin. Lotte had started the framing in August, 2 weeks after the locusts left. The locusts had come in July, the kind of cloud that blocked the sun and made the air sound like a mill race. They stripped the Turkey River bottomland in 4 days. Every standing cornstalk, every kitchen garden, every fruit tree, down to bare wood. What they left behind looked like November in July, the fields gray and stripped and silent. Lotte's corn had been 3 weeks from harvest. She had watched it disappear from the cabin doorway with Annika beside her, neither of them speaking, the sound of the insects filling the valley like something industrial and indifferent. What the locusts had not touched was the previous year's stored crop. Lotte kept 2 years of corn in the barn crib by principle, a Polish storage habit her father had drilled into her before she left Poznań at 19, crossing to Hamburg, and then to New York, and then west, by rail and wagon, to Clayton County, Iowa, where the bluff country above the Turkey River reminded her of nothing she had ever seen, and suited her completely. Her father's rule: what you grew this year, you sell. What you grew last year, you keep. You are always living on the year before, and the year before cannot be taken from you by weather or locusts or the price collapse that follows a bad season across an entire state. She had 340 bushels of 1873 corn in the crib, dried, clean, shelled from the cob, in the standard way, and stored in ventilated bins. It was her food reserve, and it was adequate. What she did not have was sufficient firewood to heat 2 structures through an Iowa winter, because the addition was not yet enclosed, and the original cabin's wood supply had been calculated for 1 building, not 2. She had started thinking about the wall cavities in August, standing inside the unfinished addition, with the framing up and the cavity spaces open on all 4 walls, feeling the air move through them. Moving air, but the same problem her father had identified in every poorly insulated building he had ever shown her. Heat moved with air, and wall cavities without fill were simply channels for cold to travel through. Her father had used rye sheaves in Poznań. She did not have rye sheaves. She had corn cobs, 4 years of them accumulated in a pile behind the barn. The stripped cobs she had kept, because burning them produced a steady low heat, good for the kitchen stove, and because throwing away anything that could be burned was a habit she had never acquired. The pile was chest high and 12 feet across, and she had been meaning to burn it through since spring. But she stood at that pile in August and thought about the open wall cavities and arrived at the question her father would have asked. What do you have that will trap air without compressing under its own weight? Rye sheaves trapped air in the spaces between stalks. Corn cobs trapped air in the spaces between cobs and in the hollow center of each cob itself. A dried field corn cob was roughly 30% hollow by volume. Packed vertically at a slight angle in a 14-inch cavity, each cob touched its neighbors at 2 or 3 points only, leaving the remaining surface area in contact with nothing but still air. Still air did not conduct cold. Her father had said this over a fence post in Poznań when she was 11 years old. She had not forgotten it, and she did not tell her neighbors what she was building until the framing was up and the cavity geometry was tested, and she was certain the principle worked. This was the Polish way of doing things. You demonstrated. You did not announce. Announcement invited argument before the evidence existed. Demonstration invited questions after the evidence was visible, which was a more productive conversation. The first neighbor to ask was a woman named Vera Horak, whose claim ran along the north boundary of the Brandt property. Vera was 46 and had come from Moravia and knew her own mind completely. She came by on a Tuesday morning in late September, looked at the cob-packed wall section Lotte had completed as a demonstration panel, pressed her palm against the inner board face, and said nothing for a long moment. How many cobs?" Vera said finally. "For this wall, 4,200. For the full addition, I estimate 17,000. Vera looked at the cob pile behind the barn. "You have that many." "I have more. I have been keeping them for 4 years. Vera pressed her palm against the board again. The inner face was noticeably warmer than the outer face, even in September. Even with no fire in the addition yet, the cob layer was already moderating the temperature differential between inside and outside. "My husband will say it will rot," Vera said. "Cobs rot when they hold moisture. These are 4-year dry. Show him the inside of one." Lotte handed her a cob from the scaffold. The center was bone dry, the color of old ivory, not a trace of the green that indicated moisture. Vera turned it in her hands. "I will show him," she said, and put it in her apron pocket. Vera Horak's husband did not say it would rot. He said something worse. He said it was a woman's idea, and that women did not understand wall construction, and that the cobs would shift and settle over winter and leave cold gaps in the cavity that would be worse than no insulation at all. He said this at the settlement store in Elkader on a Saturday morning in front of 4 other men, and the information reached Lotte by Tuesday through Vera, who reported it with the flat precision of a woman who had stopped being surprised by her husband's opinions years ago, but still considered accurate reporting a courtesy. Lotte received this information, noted it, and continued packing cobs. She had a more immediate problem than Henrik Horak's opinion. When the addition's south wall faced the Turkey River bottomland, where the locust damage was still visible in October, bare stripped stumps where the apple trees had been, gray stubble fields where the corn should have been standing golden and heavy. The sight of it from the south window opening was a daily accounting of what the season had cost. 3 weeks of harvest lost. the kitchen garden stripped to dirt, the fruit trees set back 2 years at minimum, the cash income she had planned from the 1874 crop, enough to pay the remaining balance on the land note and buy the iron cook stove she had been calculating toward for 18 months. Simply gone. What remained was the 1873 stored corn in the crib, the cob pile behind the barn, and the addition she was building with her own hands before the first hard frost locked the ground and made exterior work impossible. She packed the south wall on the 12th of October, working from scaffold with Annika, passing cobs up from the ground in a rhythm they had developed over the previous 2 weeks. Annika loading the carry basket from the cob pile, Lotte fitting each cob into the cavity with the specific quarter turn that locked it against its neighbors. They did not talk much while working. Lotte counted in Polish under her breath, groups of 20, keeping the tally in her head the way her father had kept measurements. Annika had learned to read her mother's counting rhythm and match her pace to it, passing cobs at the precise moment Lotte's hand came back for the next one. But by the end of the 12th, they had finished 3 walls. The north, east, and south cavities were packed solid from sill plate to top plate. 17,000, and some cobs pressed into 14-inch wide channels, running the full perimeter of the addition. The west wall, which shared its framing with the original cabin's east face, needed no insulation. The cabin itself provided that thermal boundary. They sealed the outer wall boards on the 13th. Lotte face-nailed the exterior sheathing with the full-length cut nails she had bought in Elkader in September, driving each one flush with 2 strikes of the hammer, the boards tight enough that a knife blade would not find a gap. She ran her hand along each course, looking for flecks. Found none. The first frost came on the 16th. Lotte had the cook stove from the original cabin moved into the addition on the 17th, not because the addition was warmer yet, but because the addition was larger and she needed to know how the cob walls handled a heat source before the real cold arrived. She built a moderate fire, the kind she would burn on a typical November evening, and sat with her back against the inner face of the north wall for an hour while Annika read by the window. The inner board face warmed slowly. Not the sharp, dry heat of a wall close to a stove. Something more distributed than that. The warmth spreading outward from the stove in concentric rings that the cob layer caught and held, rather than allowing to mine through and dissipate into the exterior air. By the end of the hour, the north wall inner face registered a warmth she could feel 6 inches from the surface without touching it. She pressed her palm flat against the outer board face. Cold, not freezing. Cool in the way a shaded surface is cool on a mild day. The 14 inches of packed cobs between inner and outer boards had absorbed the interior heat and were releasing none of it to the outside. She said nothing to Annika. She sat with the information for a long moment, running the fuel arithmetic in her head. If the wall held this differential through January, when the Turkey River Valley temperature dropped to 20 below and stayed there for weeks at a stretch, she would burn perhaps 2 cords of wood through the winter, instead of the 4 the original cabin required. 2 cords she had, 4 cords she did not. Vera Horak came by on the 20th with her oldest son Tomasz, who was 17 and had his father's broad frame, but not his father's certainty about things. Tomasz looked at the sealed exterior walls, the tight board courses, the wide cavity depth visible where Lotte had left a single demonstration section open near the door. A window into the wall, showing the cobs packed in their angled rows, each one touching its neighbors at shoulder points only, the air spaces between them visible in the afternoon light coming through the open section. He crouched and looked into the demonstration section for a long time without speaking. "How does it not settle?" he said finally. "Loose material in a wall always settles." You end up with a cold gap at the top. Angled packing, Lotte said, and she reached into the open section and demonstrated, her fingers pressing a cob lightly, showing how the angle created a mechanical interlock between adjacent cobs, each one braced against its neighbors so that downward force distributed sideways rather than compressing the column. Racked against each other, like voussoirs in an arch. The weight of the upper cobs increases the friction between the lower ones rather than pushing them down. Tomasz looked at her. My father was a builder in Poznań, Lotte said. He showed me this with rye sheaves. The geometry is the same. The boy stood up and looked at his mother. Something passed between them that Lotte did not try to read. Then Tomasz said, We have a cob pile from 3 seasons. Papa burns them in October. If he has not burned this year's yet, Lotte said. And if you have wall cavities that need filling, I can show you the packing method in an afternoon. Vera's expression did not change, but her eyes moved to Lotte's with a directness that said everything necessary. Henrik will be in El Kader on Friday, she said. He usually stays through Saturday noon. Lotte nodded. Friday morning, then. She spent Friday morning at the Horak claim with Annika, packing a 12-foot demonstration section of the Horak cabin's north wall cavity, a section Henrik had been meaning to fill with sawdust since the previous spring and had not gotten to. The Horak cobs were 3-season dry and slightly smaller than Lotte's Turkey River field variety, requiring a minor adjustment to the packing angle, which Annika worked out on the second row without being directed. Tomasz worked beside them, learning the quarter turn with quick hands, his count in Czech matching Lotte's Polish count in rhythm, if not in language. They finished the demonstration section by midday. Lotte showed Vera the thermal test, palm against inner board face after 20 minutes of the kitchen stove running, then palm against outer board face. The differential was already measurable. Vera held her hand against the outer board for a long time. He will say you used a trick, Vera said. The trick is packed cobs and 14-inch cavities, Lotte said. Show him the demonstration section. Let him press his palm against both faces. Let the wall answer for itself. She walked home with Annika through the October bottomland, the Turkey River running low and gray below the bluffs, the stripped apple stumps still visible in the Horak orchard, mid the whole valley, carrying the particular subdued quality of a landscape that has been damaged and is waiting to see what comes next. 3 days later, Henrik Horak finished packing his north and west wall cavities himself, working from the demonstration section Lotte had left open as a template. He did not mention Lotte's name when he described the method to his neighbor Casimir Wojcik the following week at the settlement store. Casimir Wojcik rode out to the Brandt claim 2 days after that and asked Lotte directly. She showed him everything. November arrived, and the temperature dropped through 30 degrees and kept falling, the Iowa cold settling into the Turkey River Valley with the unhurried certainty of something that had done this every year for longer than anyone could remember and intended to keep doing it. Yet the hard cold came on the 4th of December and did not release Clayton County for 11 weeks. Not the gradual cold of a normal Iowa winter that arrived in stages and gave a person time to adjust their habits. This was the kind that dropped 30 degrees in a single afternoon and held there, the Turkey River freezing solid in 48 hours, the bluff roads turning to iron, the sky going the flat white of a tin ceiling and staying that way for days at a stretch. By the second week of December, the temperature at dawn sat at 18 below zero, and the wind off the bluffs added its own accounting to that figure in ways that a thermometer could not fully capture. Lotte ran the addition stove on a morning and evening burn, 2 fires per day, each one moderate, each one lasting 2 hours before she banked it to coals and let the cob walls carry the room through the hours between. She had established this rhythm in November, when the first frosts tested her calculations, and the calculations had held. The inner wall faces retained their warmth for 6 to 8 hours after each burn, releasing heat in the slow, even way of materials that had absorbed it gradually and gave it back the same way. The addition stayed between 52 and 58 degrees through the coldest nights. The original cabin, running its own stove on the same schedule, stayed between 48 and 54. She burned through her first cord of birch in the first 5 weeks of winter. At the rate she was going, the 2 cords would last through March with a small reserve remaining. She recorded nothing in a ledger, and she kept the fuel count in her head in the Polish method, not numbers floating loose, but numbers attached to physical objects, each cord visualized as a specific section of the woodpile, its depletion tracked daily with a precision that did not require writing. Annika managed the food stores with the same method, applied to the corn crib. Every morning she counted the bushel baskets, updated the figure in her head, and reported the current number to her mother at breakfast. Not because Lotte could not count it herself, but because the act of reporting daily made the number real in a way that occasional checking did not. And her grandmother had taught her this in a letter from Poznań that arrived the year they filed the claim, a letter full of practical information delivered in the tone of someone who understood that advice travels better when it arrives disguised as conversation. The Horak claim made it through January on the strength of the north and west wall sections Tomasz had packed in October. Henryk Horak told Casimir Wojcik in January that the method worked better than he had expected, which was as close to acknowledgement as Henryk Horak's nature allowed. Casimir Wojcik had packed his own walls in November after visiting the Brandt claim, working 3 weekends straight with his 2 sons to finish before the ground froze, and his family spent January in a structure that held heat through the night without a midnight fire feeding. Casimir came by the Brandt claim in January to report this, standing at the addition door with his hat in his hands, and his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has been proved correct about something he was not certain of when he committed to it. He said the east wall still had a cold section near the foundation, where the cobs had been packed in a single layer rather than double due to running short of material. Lotte told him to stuff the gap with dried corn husk folded into tight cylinders and pack them the same way as the cobs. He nodded, memorized it, and left. 3 families on the Turkey River bottomland did not pack their walls before the cold came. 2 of them had heard about the cob method in October and decided to wait and see whether the results justified the labor. But the 3rd had not heard about it at all, a family named Rzepa, who had filed their claim in August and had not yet established the neighbor connections that carried practical information through a rural settlement. The Rzepa cabin was a single-wall structure, standard framing, the kind that a first-year homesteader built from the lumber available and the knowledge carried from wherever they had come from, which in the Rzepa family's case was a part of southern Poland where winters were cold, but not Iowa cold, not Turkey River Valley in January cold. Lotte heard about the Rzepa family from Vera Horak in the 2nd week of January. Their youngest child, a boy of 4, had developed the deep chest cough that started with cold and ended in places no parent wanted to follow it, which the cabin was holding temperature during the day when the stove burned hard, but dropping to dangerous levels at night when the fire banked and the single-wall structure gave up its heat to the Iowa darkness in the fast, careless way of buildings with nothing between inside and outside but an inch of pine board. She and Annika went to the Rzepa claim on a Thursday morning, carrying 200 cobs on the sled and the tools for cutting access panels in the exterior sheathing. This was not the standard method. Standard method required the wall cavity to be open from the top before sheathing was applied. Cutting access panels in a finished wall was slower and left the exterior temporarily open to weather, which in January in Clayton County was not a theoretical inconvenience, but a specific physical danger. Lotte had thought through the access panel method in November as a contingency, knowing there would be families who needed help after the cold arrived rather than before it. She had the panel dimensions calculated and the cutting sequence worked out. She explained none of this to the Rzepas. She showed up with the sled and the Cobs and the tools, and she started working. Annika cut the first access panel with the keyhole saw, while Lotte explained the cavity geometry to Władysław Rzepa, who was 31 and had a carpenter's instincts, and understood the mechanical logic of the angled packing immediately once he saw the first row go in. He took the second panel himself, cutting it with more confidence than Annika had used on the first because he knew what he was doing with a saw, and she was still learning. By noon, they had 3 wall sections packed and sealed, the access panels re-nailed over the filled cavities, the exterior restored. The boy's cough improved within a week. Whether this was the walls or the natural course of the illness, Lotte did not speculate. She was not a doctor. She was a woman who understood wall construction and heat retention and the specific geometry of dried corn cobs packed at an angle in a 14-inch cavity, and she had applied that knowledge to a cold cabin, and the cabin was warmer afterward, and those were the facts available to her. Spring came late. March brought false warmth that retreated twice before April finally held. The Turkey River ran high with snowmelt, and the bottomland roads went to mud for 6 weeks, the kind of mud that swallowed wheel hubs and required a full team to pull a loaded wagon through. The locust damage from the previous summer was still visible in the stripped orchard stumps, though the kitchen gardens had been replanted in cold frames, and the first green was showing by mid-April. Lotte pulled the oldest cobs from the addition's east wall cavity in the first week of April, removing the access panel she had installed in November specifically for this purpose. The cobs came out dry and clean, 4 months in a sealed wall cavity, having done nothing to their condition except darken the outer surface slightly, where they had sat against the exterior sheathing. She carried them to the barn and ran them through the hand sheller, and a simple iron device clamped to a workbench that stripped kernels from a cob in 4 seconds with a turn of the handle. The kernels that came off were hard and dry and identical in quality to the kernels in the 1873 crib corn. 4 months insulating a wall had not compromised them as food. She shelled 40 bushels from the east wall cavity over 3 days and stored the kernels in the crib alongside the 1873 reserves. The east wall cavity she repacked with fresh cobs from the 1874 pile. The cobs the locusts had not touched, stripped clean from what remained of the harvest debris. New insulation in, old insulation out, and into the food supply, the cycle running as she had designed it to run. Annika stood at the crib door, watching the shelled kernels pour into the bin and said, 40 bushels we did not have in September. 40 bushels we had all winter, Lotte said, in the wall. The Clayton County Courier ran a small item in its May edition, noting that several farms along the Turkey River had survived the severe winter with notably lower fuel consumption than surrounding areas, attributed by the paper to unspecified improvements in building construction. The item did not mention Lotte Brandt or corn cobs or a packing method carried from Poznań across the Atlantic in the memory of a woman who had been watching her father build walls since she was old enough to hold a cob steady. Knowledge documented by a newspaper as an unnamed improvement was still knowledge, and it moved through Clayton County that summer in the way useful things move through small settlements, conversation by conversation, demonstration by demonstration, one palm pressed against a warm inner wall face at a time. Lotte replanted the orchard in May. 12 new apple trees from the El Cader nursery, set in the same positions as the stripped stumps. The ground worked deep and dressed with the barn compost she had been building since August. They would not bear for 3 years. She planted them anyway, because 3 years from now she intended to be exactly where she was standing, with walls full of dry cobs and a crib full of the year before's corn, and apple trees that owed her nothing except their fruit in season. She pressed her palm against the addition's outer wall on a May morning, feeling the spring sun's warmth in the boards, and thought about her father standing at a fence post in Poznań, telling an 11-year-old girl that still air held heat, and moving air stole it. He had been right. He had been right about that, and about the year before corn, and about demonstration being more persuasive than announcement. And he had never seen Iowa, or the Turkey River bluff country, or the locust damage of July 1874. But the things he knew had traveled here anyway, and done their work. Some knowledge is like that. It does not need to understand the specific place it is going. It only needs someone willing to carry it. If Lotte and Annika's story pulled you in, hit the like button. It tells us to keep these stories coming. Subscribe to Wild West Survival Tales so you never miss the next character fighting to stay alive on the frontier. Drop a comment below. Would you have started packing those wall cavities in October like Lotte did, or waited to see how bad the winter got first? Because on this channel, the next survivor is already waiting.